2022 witnessed significant moments in China's relations with countries in Europe, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East. I've handpicked 3 such moments to help you understand how China's diplomacy evolved in the year, but by all means, it's been a busy one for China's effort to build a human community of shared future. I would therefore ask my panelists to pick one more moment of their choice, one that they believe will shape China's diplomatic outlook and the world possibly in 2023 and beyond. I'm pleased to be joined by Xiao Yuqun, Senior Fellow of the Center for American Studies at Shanghai Institute for International Studies, joining us from Shanghai. Joining us from California, the United States, by Nabil Fahmy, former Foreign Minister of Egypt, and from Beijing by Professor Xie Tao, Dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. The warmest welcome to all 3 of you and happy holidays. So, without much ado, let's go straight to moment number 1. And I think one area of China's diplomacy that's particularly worth commenting on is the relationship between China and European countries. For instance, we had a series of meetings during this year. President Xi met with EU leaders virtually, EU institution leaders, by the way, virtually on April the 1st. And then German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited China on November the 4th. President Xi met with leaders of France, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and etc. at the G20, on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Indonesia in mid-November. And last but not least, European Council President Charles Michel's visit to China end of November. And I actually talked to Mr. Jörg Wuttke, who is president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, earlier this year in summer, and he had this to say.
You know, with the expectations as China has a very low GDP per capita, that China will grow for decades to come, and we want to be part of it, hence the lobbying to have more market access. But at the same time, of course, Ukraine has an impact, but the much bigger impact at the time here now is Omicron, the supply chain. So in a way, we are really dealing with a very complex pattern of challenges that we didn't foresee about a year ago.
Mr. Fahmy, let me go to you first. Watching from your perspective, obviously time has changed very rapidly over the past weeks. How did you look at the rather rational approach European leaders, especially major European leaders, have demonstrated in their dealing with China, especially since the second half of this year?
Actually, we looked at it with a sense of cautious optimism, and we frankly applauded that sense of pragmatism. We have been regularly telling our international friends, you need to engage with everybody, whether you think they're a competitor, a friend, or even a foe. Dialogue should be the name of the game. Competition is legitimate.
When you talk about we, specifically, what are you referring to?
The international community as a whole. And there is a rising tension, last year at least, between the US and the West and China. And this shifted a little bit with the Ukraine issue towards Russia, but still, China was looked at as a potential problem. And then suddenly, with Ukraine, people started to look at China and say, well, maybe it's helpful to engage China. That's been our position in Egypt from the very beginning. China is an important country, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to have not only influence, it's going to have increased influence. So everybody needs to engage each other. And I would simply throw in very quickly, there was a historic visit by the Chinese president to the Arab world, where he met in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi leadership, with Arab leadership from different countries, and GCC leadership. And in a very important phrase that kept being used by the Chinese was shared destiny, shared interest. It was this respect for each other, the desire to work with each other. It doesn't mean we will always agree, but the point of engaging was extremely important. And I would close my preliminary comments with saying the international community, the international order, is facing a perfect storm. And unless we get the major players, US, of course, from one side, Russia is still a significant player, and China, to engage constructively and help us all work together to deal with this storm, we will all suffer the consequences.
Ms. Shao, let me go to you. Of course, you're an expert of US studies based in Shanghai, but how important are the European position, especially views by major European countries such as German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who visited China in mid-November despite a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism. Why do you think European leaders are taking this courageous step, I would say, but of course, a step that in China's eye, that's definitely in the right direction?
I agree with Mr. Fahmi's view that we have to engage with each other. And I think major European country leaders, they understand this. And of course, they have faced a lot of pressure from the United States. The U.S. current monetary policy and financial policy, economic policy has put a lot of pressure on European countries to hurt their competitiveness. So I think the European politicians, they understand this. So German Chancellor Scholz, he has been very pragmatic. And of course, within his country, I think diplomatically, they have done a lot of balancing a job, try not to focus too much on China. But anyway, China is a very, very important market for Germany and also other European countries. They have to protect their market share. This is the first thing. The second is because of the military conflict in Ukraine, that Europe has faced a lot of pressures, like inflation, like energy crisis, all those things. That also pushed the European leaders to come to China and to talk with the Chinese leaders to strengthen China-Europe relations.
Professor Xie, is this a tactic out of expediency then?
I would be inclined to agree with your characterization just now, Liu Xian. You say it's more kind of expediency out of necessity. I say this because I have always been struck by kind of a combination of pragmatism and the skepticism in European countries. So you go to Brussels and then you hear leadership talk about human rights, values, norms, but then they pick fights with the Chinese government. And then they also want to say we want to pursue a strategic autonomy. But then sometimes they will say, wow, probably we can't do this, at least at the moment. We need to go back to China and we talk about business, investment, and others, right? So I think to put in a less flattering way, I think there's kind of this hypocrisy mixed with some kind of pragmatic needs. Probably that's a tradition in many Western countries of diplomacy, because they have always tried to portray themselves as a champion of some so-called universal values. But then at the other times, they found that their values conflict with their own economic interests. And so they have always tried to walk a very fine line between pragmatism and skepticism. But I do applaud the Chancellor Scholz's visit to China, despite this enormous pressure from, say, the country across the Atlantic and from other capitals. I do think that even though you have your values, but you have to be down to earth. You have to be really, think about the long-term benefits. We don't have to be kind of an economic determinist to argue that Germans have to come to Beijing or the French have to bow their head in front of us. But in the end, every country, their I would say their most important security. It's not just about political security. It's about economic security for each and every citizen. Now, Mr. Fahid mentioned about the Ukrainian conflict, and Ms. Sao also mentioned, right, with this rising prices, the energy, and the winter is coming, you got to feed your people, clothe your people, provide heating for them.
What about the other end for China? Is it just China giving market access, China giving Europeans something? Does China also need Europe?
We do, of course, but the key difference, Liu Shen, you see that we don't go around and telling people through the media and telling people we really put some values, universal values up front. We would not try to sacrifice our values for some short-term interest. That's very different from what the Chinese leadership has been doing. We do things that we think are in the best interest of the international community, as well as in the interest of the Chinese people.
Of course, there is a lot to be said, but time being very limited, I'm going to move on and give people the opportunity to think for themselves. Moment number two, as Mr. Fahmy just mentioned, China and Arabic relations. President Xi Jinping made a multi-day state visit to Saudi Arabia. This December, he also attended the first ever China-Arab State Summit and the China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit, which was held in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. I talked to former Tunisian Foreign Minister Khamis Jinawi on China-Arab ties, and he had this to say.
I think honestly, I don't think the matter is choosing between China and the United States. From the Arab perspective, I think it's increasing relationship with an old partner, China, but that does not mean that the Arabs will look away from their relationship with the United States. They have also strong relationship, particularly the Gulf countries and even North African countries. They have good, substantial relationship with the United States, particularly on economic, but also on security. And I think that will continue from the Arab partner. So it's not choosing between China and the United States. It's developing a relationship with one major partner, which is China.
Mr. Fahmy, once again, let me go to you. What does the first ever summits mean for Arab countries? What do you think China really want in that region?
Sure. Let me very quickly answer your question with a small caveat at the beginning. When I was foreign minister, 4 days after I was appointed, I gave a statement saying that one of the principles of Egypt's foreign policy will be ensuring that we have multiple options in our international relations, which basically meant continuing to develop our Western relations, continuing to develop our Russian relations, but also continue to develop, and even more strongly, Asian relations, especially with China. So it's always about providing better options for our own national interest. And that means engaging the significant players around the world, not at the expense of each other, but for the benefit of our own interests. That being said, the Arab-Chinese summit, which you correctly mentioned, gained a lot of attention because of the level of participation, because of the basic principles mentioned. They're all about working together, respecting each other, understanding each other. But the reality is, it was perceived initially in the West as being anti-West, that the region was moving away from the West towards China. And I issued statements saying that's superficial and quite childish. One, because China today already is the largest trading partner with a number of Arab countries, even before the summit. And it makes sense that we will do more of that, as would China, because it has interests in the Arab Gulf, particularly energy. But also, the fact is, you have strong relations in the West with China economically. So why shouldn't we? To answer your question directly, the Arab leaders looked towards the Chinese president with two angles. One, what can we do nationally on a bilateral level, economic projects and development and so on. And there were significant indications there. But more importantly, also, and this goes to the point earlier about the perfect storm, Well, is the Chinese leader ready to take on a leadership role in the international order in trying to establish a new international order? The international order today is an order of disorder, and it's going to take a decade to fix gradually, not one against each other, but how do we work together? And the Arab countries that face tremendous problems, socioeconomic, but also security problems, we're trying to look for, okay, who are the new international leaders? And I think the summit was very successful.
All right. Professor Xie, see, even from what Mr. Fahmy just said, a lot of Western critics would say, see, I told you, look, China wants to chip away from the United States or the West influence or interest in the region. What is China eyeing for? What is China eyeing for?
Just like Mr. Fahmy said, somehow I would say, unfortunately, there's this very kind of fixed thinking among many Western observers of China's foreign policy, that it has to be a zero-sum game. Either China loses or China wins, or either the West wins or either the West wins, and so there's no in between. But in reality, I think that Mr. Fahmy, he's a foreign minister, and so he knows the delicacy, all these secret negotiations and others. In the real world, I think there's nothing goes on that it's just a pure black and white. It's a zero-sum game. But of course, we cannot tell Westerners that you have to change your mindset, right? The best we Chinese can do is that we look at our own behavior. How can we best serve the international community? Like I said, every country have to, number one, serve the interest of its own people. Second, with power comes responsibility. China is taking this very seriously, a responsible stakeholder. And so Mr. Fahmy said, what is Chinese leadership's vision about its role in the international community? I think our leadership is that serious about this. We do want to contribute more. But unfortunately, like I said, whenever China wants to do something, when China throw an initiative, it's always kind of invites skepticism, suspicion, and resentment from many countries in the West.
Ms. Shao, very briefly, how could China make it clear by words and deeds that it really comes with the intention to contribute to peace and development in the region? Is it possible at all?
I think China has already made it very clear that our goal in Middle East is for peace and development and for the interests of the whole region. Because if you read the readout that given by the foreign ministry, the Chinese foreign ministry, actually the two sides, their cooperation on public health, food crisis, energy security, green and low carbon economy, all those topics are for the living of the people and for the transformation of the international order into a good direction. So I think China has already made it very clearly. But if people look at that through a black or white angle, then certainly the answer will be the other way. It's like China is competing with the United States for geostrategic influence. So no matter whatever China has said or done, those people will still look at China in this way. So that's my thinking.
Let's give it some time, basically, right? Let the reality, let the deeds speak for themselves. Finally, let's move on. Let's move on to the third moment of my choice, of course, which I think is really quite interesting, is the warming up of relations between China and Australia on November the 15th during President Xi's meetings in Bali, Indonesia. He met with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and then President Xi said, and I quote, that both as important countries in the Asia-Pacific region, China and Australia need to improve, uphold, and further develop the relationship. It not only serves the fundamental interests of the two peoples, but also helps to promote peace and development in the Asia-Pacific and beyond. And that's just not it. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited China on December the 20th to 21st. This was the first time a ministerial level official has traveled to Beijing since November 2019, and her visit also coincided with the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between the two countries. And of course, Chinese leadership and Australian leadership exchanged messages of congratulation, where Australian Prime Minister Albanese said in the message that he firmly believes that a stable Australia-China relationship is in line with the interests of both countries, quote unquote. Professor Xie, let me go directly to you. How is this cycle of development, or this learning curve come about, and what propelled things to turn for the better finally?
I'm not an expert on China-Australia relations. My last visit in Australia was back in 2018. This is even before that. My sense is that both countries have demonstrated a very remarkable degree of willingness to accommodate each other right now. I would argue that what has happened over the past 4 years is more a product of Australian domestic politics. This reminds me of something that we often use in studying American politics, that is a paranoia. Somehow, some Australian politicians get very paranoid about the rise of China. And I often tell my students in the class, I say, look, how far away? Which country is closer to Australia, China or Japan? Remember back in the Second World War, Australia was just nearly invaded by Japan, right? But there was never a kind of hysteria about Japan or other countries. So I think this is all man-made. This is all hysteria coming from some politicians.
I'm going to interrupt here. Look, the making of the Cold War was never a one-sided event. Anybody who read that period of history understood how events on both sides reinforced kind of the shaping of the situation. From the Chinese perspective, Professor Xie, I'm going to put this to you. Could China have done something differently?
To be honest, I think we could have, toned down a little bit. In terms of our style, in terms of the way that we deal with our Australian counterparts in public. This is my personal view. But at the end of the day, I'm not a diplomat, unlike Mr. Fahimi. But I think largely, I would say, overwhelming majority of Chinese people and the Chinese elite would agree with what the Chinese government has said and done to Australia. I would say this. Yeah.
All right. A couple of minutes left. I am going to open the opportunity to each one of you to tell us your pick of a diplomatic moment in China's experience in 2022. Which other moment you would give that you think is significant, that may indicate a direction in the future for the year 2023 for China and for the rest of the world? Mr. Fahmi, let me start with you.
Sure, let me answer quickly. Indications of Chinese wisdom were what struck me most. And I saw that when there was a lot of talk about possibly using weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. And even though there was tension between the Americans and the Chinese, when Biden met the Chinese president, part of the statement was that nuclear weapons should never be used and a war should never be started. And that also came up with the German chancellor as well. That was one thing, an indication of we will compete, we will have problems, but in international relations, you have to be statesmanlike and wise. The same reflection happened in the Arab-Chinese summit. As I mentioned earlier, the talk about shared interest, mutual benefit, greater understanding. It wasn't, as the professor said, a zero-sum outlook. We're talking about mutual interest. And I would throw in one last point.
Mhm.
Building on that vision and wisdom, I would urge the Chinese to enunciate even further what kind of world order they envisage we should be working on in the future. And it's because of that, that even though I'm not an expert on Chinese Australia, I again found the discussion between Australia and China interesting, because it indicated an understanding that if you want to talk about peace, you talk about peace and cooperation, first of all, with your neighbors or your proximity. That's where, and I'll close by saying, again, when I was foreign minister, one of the first decisions I took was to have specialized units looking at relations with our neighbors. And I said, you report to me directly anytime. It's more important to me to know what my neighbors think, much more than what happens with the US or Russia or China. I'll deal with that.
Okay. Professor Xie, your take finally.
I just go along with Mr. Fahimi. In international relations, I often tell my students, you can choose your friends, you can choose your enemies, but you cannot choose your neighbors. And so China's number one priority, as demonstrated by President Xi's visit in Bali and the APEC summit, that shows that Chinese leadership is really, really putting our neighborhood, a stable, secure neighborhood, as China's number one priority. And I really look forward to more diplomatic events and initiatives targeting China's neighboring countries in 2023.
All right. We all have our fingers crossed and wish that more would be done in a better way, more rationality would prevail, and of course, greater health and prosperity for everyone on earth. Thank you so much for taking your time out in this holiday season to talk about these important issues facing us. My guests have been Xiaoyu Qing joining us from Shanghai, Nabil Fahmi joining us from California, the United States, and Professor Xie Tao joining us from Beijing.